Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives Podcast. I'm Adam Turteltaub from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us today from Orlando is Wendy Evans, Senior Corporate Ethics Investigator of Lockheed Martin. And joining us from Atlanta is Georgina Heasman, Senior Manager, Global Investigations, Booking Holdings. And not surprisingly, we'll be talking about investigations. The two of them lead our investigations workshop and are the authors of the new book, Fundamentals of Investigations, A Practical Guide. Wendy, Georgina, thanks for joining us. Let's dive right in on this. We'll start with you, Wendy. First of all, it was great seeing you at the 24th Annual Compliance and Ethics Institute. Today, I want to follow up on some of the things you talked about there. But first, I have a question for you. With ethics and compliance being such a diverse field today, why is it important for our listeners to be aware of the investigations process, even if they aren't an investigator?
That is a really great point, Adam. And what I think is interesting for people to be aware of is the elements of an effective ethics and compliance program. They all work together to ensure that organizations identify, mitigate, monitor, and obviously, if possible, prevent risk to their company. So the investigative process is just a key role in that endeavor. The U.S. Department of Justice's ECCP, Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs, actually calls out our investigative process in Section D under confidential reporting and investigations, talks about how important the investigative process is. And that includes, whistleblower protection mechanisms and how important anti-retaliation policies are. Because unfortunately, today we live in a world not of if, but when there is a policy or regulatory issue. And those tuning in today are trusted agents of their organization. So we have to have our ears to the ground, so to speak. So our investigative process is a way for our folks, whether that's employees, contractors, suppliers, customers, to speak up and allow us to look into their concerns. It could be it's not an investigation. Maybe it's a policy clarification. But if misconduct's reported, we have to conduct a thorough investigation to address the risk.
I think you're absolutely right about that. It does touch everyone. Now, Georgina, we may take for granted that our employees, suppliers, contractors, and customers all know how to reach us. Wendy, you talked about people maybe just reaching out with a question. I've heard in their presentation talks to the importance of having multiple contact methods, including the ways people report anonymously. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, of course. And thank you so much for giving us this platform to talk about investigations. And I'm really happy I got to see both of you in Nashville. But as Wendy mentioned, under the ECCP, it's like one of the very first sentences in which it says sort of, you have to have a trusted mechanism by which employees can raise concerns anonymously in confidentiality. So apart from the fact that there's guidance that says you should have it, it's really an important attribute to your program because people are going to find ways to report anonymously whether you have this capacity or not. Certainly, we've seen various ways people do this, either through creating emails or raising concerns on behalf of groups in different ways. So there's lots of different ways that people do it. But if you don't have the channel to support it, you might be missing out on learning of concerns in your organization. So even though we know we live in an age where it's really easy for people to create anonymous ways to reach you, just take that step in your organization to make it easier for them so that you're giving everyone an opportunity to raise concerns of possible misconduct and to reduce that risk in your organization.
So when they do raise those issues, the intake interview can be is incredibly important. Do either of you have any tips for getting as much information as you can at that point? What are some of the best practices out there?
Yeah, and Georgina may want to weigh in here, but one thing that the two of us joke about, right, Georgina, is sometimes we have reporting parties uh, who send you a 40-page PowerPoint presentation or a 10-page single-spaced letter, and it's tempting to say, oh, you know what, they wrote me a 10-page letter. I think it's pretty thorough. You should always have questions to clarify, because we need to keep in mind that's written from their perspective, and we're going to be putting together the pieces of the puzzle from other evidence we gather that the reporter just may not have access to. Evidence otherwise, but it's important to speak with that reporter to get clarification of their concerns and to fully understand the facts and circumstances of those. So it's really critical to have that either by teams like we're doing today, a teams meeting, or a face to face interview with that reporting party. And you got to keep in mind, some reporters are very reluctantly reporting to begin with. So we have to establish that rapport with them and get as much information as we can out of that initial interview, just in case for some reason they leave the company or they stop communicating with us. Hopefully you establish enough trust and rapport that you keep that contact to give them updates and closing feedback. But it's so important to just talk about the who, what, when, where, and why. Wouldn't you say, Georgina?
100%. And I would also say, just from experience, those reports that are like long, there's always more information that person is willing to share. So even though it may look like you have all the information initially, uh, generally those are the types of folks that are going to provide you a lot more contextual information if you ask the right questions. So
Exactly.
So let me follow up on something there with you, Georgina. As you talk
mhm.
about gathering information, Wendy referred to gathering evidence. What
Yeah.
are the types of evidence that corporate investigators should focus on getting?
Yeah, so fair question. And I think when we're talking about interviews, those are really sort of fall under the bucket of like testimonial evidence, right? Those are sort of the stories of situations, and you're asking those who, what, when, where, why questions to sort of figure out where to look next. And um, uh, sort of the second, I would say, more popular, if you will, type of evidence that we often are relying on in workplace investigations is what constitutes documentary evidence. So those are the things, the actual tangible pieces of work product or conversations over Slack or email or documents that really support what it is that's being alleged. And so you want to make sure in your whatever evidence gathering sort of steps you need to take, really, as part of your obligation as an investigator, you want to make sure you have developed relationships with various departments and stakeholders in your organization where you find yourself often having to go look. So whether that's a specific colleague in HR that you can rely on to pull a personnel file, or somebody in the security team to help you pull access card swipes or something like that. So there's various ways, but I would say those are the top two that we are often using as part of our work as investigators in the workplace.
Now, let me ask you both this question. What's some of the evidence that you don't want, or best described as sort of distractions that lead to scope creep that's unnecessary? Any rules of the road for what sort of is worth avoiding?
Yeah, and Wendy, I can kick us off, but welcome you to jump in at any point. But I think the trickiest part when it comes to evidence gathering is sometimes what happens is you get too much information, or you get inundated with notes, and certainly since the introduction of AI in the workplace and note taking capabilities with virtual meetings that record like almost every single statement, you sometimes get inundated with information that you don't actually need and that's not relevant to your inquiry. So I always, as much as I encourage people sharing whatever they think is important, I also ask I also kind of lean on that individual to help me readily identify what they think is important. So, if they're going to share a 10-page document of a meeting, help me focus where to look. What about you, Wendy? What are your thoughts?
Spot on. And I would just add this when you talk about maybe obstacles or distractions. When you get this information from, data, say, badging records or forensic computer data, it's got to be analyzed. And some larger organizations out there, well, you may have a whole robust team of analysts to help you. Others of us maybe wind up doing a lot of the analysis ourselves. So maybe not an obstacle, but it's something to consider, especially when you get into a complex investigation. So resources can definitely present a kind of a challenge for all of us in turning around timely and thorough investigations. And I think we need to remember, even the DOJ recognizes that there's not a one size fits all. Every organization is of a different size, different structure, and the main thing is, are you adequately resourced? And that's where relationships are so important within your organization to get some subject matter expertise you may need and helping you with that challenge.
Well, speaking of subject matter expertise, thank you so much for the two of you for your expertise in this area. And I look forward to our follow-up podcast talking more about investigations. I want to thank all of you who listened for joining us today. I'm Adam Turteltaub from SCCE and HCCA. I hope we're able to expand your compliance perspective.